Welcome everyone to our penultimate meeting of the Whitehead Reading Group, looking at the archive. I'm Brianne Donaldson and I teach at University of California, Irvine in religious studies and philosophy. And I like to think Whitehead in relation to South Asian thought and the question of the animal. And it's been great to be with you these last weeks. We will have one more meeting on June 4th, just as a way to usher in our summer. And at this point, let me turn it over to Brian for any announcements.
Good morning, everybody. In case this is your first time, my name is Brian Henning. I'm a professor of philosophy and environmental studies at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, and I'm the executive editor of the Critical Edition. It's great to be with you here today. Maybe I'll quickly just, well, should I grab this sharing, Brianne? Is that okay? Thanks. So just bringing to your attention again, this opportunity that we have pushed off in case you weren't here last time. We are holding a virtual conference on the second volume of the Critical Edition of Whitehead. This is going to be held in September of 2022. And so there's time to buy the book and to read it and to propose a paper topic. Those proposals are not due until not this summer, but the summer after. So you've got time. So, but it is a hefty volume. So make sure if you are considering doing this, that you go ahead and get that volume now and begin working your way through it so you can be in a position to submit a paper for this conference. And notice that as far as we know, I think that the discount code is still available, which you can find on the website. So if you go to whiteheadresearch.org and go to occasions and click on WPRP conferences, you can find the information that you see on your screen now. So that is our main update as far as the edition. Look for, if you have not already, when you go to the Whitehead Research Project website, make sure you subscribe to our research blog. We send out quarterly updates on the Critical Edition. We'll have another one, I'm guessing, at the end of June, updating you on the progress of the edition. Also, at any time, if you go to the Critical Edition's landing page, you can also find a summary of where we are in the editing and transcribing, publishing of the various portions of the Critical Edition as we work our way through it. So we try and keep this up to date, giving you a sense as to where we are and where we're headed. Always feel free to take a look at that there and to subscribe to the research blog so you're getting notices. Okay, that's all from me.
Thanks, Brian. Oh, I'm so relieved that you have pushed that conference back. My brain was starting to release steam. And so it's such a great little intellectual mercy. And hopefully more people can participate. Let's see, now we're going to turn it over to Joe Petek, our resident archivist, who will talk a little bit about the two pieces that we are looking at today. Morning, Joe.
Good morning, Brianne. Hello again, everyone. Once again, my name is Joe Petek. I'm the Whitehead Research Project's Chief Archivist and the Assistant Editor for the Critical Edition of Whitehead. And as with previous sessions, I'd like to start us off by giving a little background for the reading we're discussing today. I don't have quite as much background as I've had for some of the other readings, but hopefully this will still be somewhat helpful. I'll start by talking about the Al Smith toast, since that's the earlier of the two documents. As you can see on the document itself, Whitehead's speech was delivered on May 14th, 1929, which would have been at the end of the spring term. Whitehead had delivered his Gifford lectures a year earlier, though Process and Reality had yet to hit the shelves. And as for the man he was toasting, Al Smith had been the Democratic Party's nominee for President of the United States 6 months earlier, the first Catholic nominee of a major American political party. He lost to Herbert Hoover, but he was still an important political figure and would seek the party nomination again 4 years later in 1932, though he would lose to the eventual winner of the election, FDR. The New York Times reported on the event the following day on May 15th. It was described as a, quote, testimonial dinner given for him by a group which included the 40 Harvard professors who endorsed his candidacy for president. It seems apparent from the article that Whitehead himself was far from the only person to give a speech, which I guess isn't a big surprise for events like this. In fact, the Times article doesn't even mention Whitehead at all. He wasn't considered one of the headliners, apparently. It does say that Whitehead's friend Felix Frankfurter was there and sat to Smith's immediate left. He had helped found the ACLU in 1920 and had gained some notoriety in the mid-20s for his defense of Sacco and Vanzetti, the two Italian immigrants who were sentenced to death on robbery and murder charges, probably falsely. He wrote a famous article in the Atlantic Monthly about the case, which Whitehead himself discussed in a letter to his son North in March of 1927, about 2 years earlier, saying that there was, quote, very little doubt but that they were entirely innocent, and that criminal courts are not the strongest point of this great country. Also present was one of the former lawyers of Sacco and Vanzetti, William G. Thompson, and some local politicians, and another famous Harvard law professor, Zechariah Chaffee. The Times misspelled his name. I truthfully don't know very much about the politics at the time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, lest I make myself look a fool. Possibly someone else in our little group knows more than I do about 1920s and 1930s American political history and can enlighten us further when we start the discussion. But I can say at a very general level that Smith was a Democrat who was more on the conservative side of things and ended up publicly opposing FDR's New Deal policies and actually endorsed the Republican candidate for president in 1936 and I think in 1940 as well, possibly. But as for Whitehead, I'm not sure which man he would have aligned himself more closely with policy-wise. His presence at this dinner certainly shows that he supported Smith. As for FDR, Lucian Price's dialogue seemed to say that Whitehead was conscious that FDR's policies upset his richer friends intensely, but that he himself found them wise. And then there is Eleanor Roosevelt's visit with Whitehead, the Whiteheads, in April of 1942. He wrote her a thank you letter that's now in the FDR Presidential Library, and it says, quote, "We cannot exaggerate our appreciation of the wonderful work which you are doing in transforming the bleak social agencies of the past by the personal exercise of kindness, interest, and directive knowledge," unquote. So make of that what you will. And now let me say a few things about the 80th birthday address. First, it's probably worth saying that Whitehead was just about at the end of his philosophical work. He would deliver the Ingersoll Lecture at the Harvard Divinity School 2 months later, which would be published as Immortality in his Library of Living Philosophers volume, and would also present his Statesmanship and Specialized Learning at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in October of 1941, but these would be his last philosophical publications aside from the 1947 book Essays in Science and Philosophy, which was an anthology of earlier work. So these remarks of his come right as he's about to step off the public stage for good. The party was held by the Harvard Philosophy Department, and Lowe's biography tells us that more than 50 people attended. I have no trouble believing this, for we have many, many letters of congratulations to Whitehead on his 80th birthday as part of the donation we received from his grandson, including one from Felix Frankfurter, who couldn't be there on account of he couldn't get away from his duties of the Supreme Court, to which he'd been appointed in 1939. William Ernest Hocking was there, of course, whose letter prefaces the notes for Whitehead's speech. Hocking may have been the professor at Harvard who was the most amenable to Whitehead's philosophy, being himself a fellow metaphysician. He had attended most of Whitehead's first philosophy class upon his arrival, and he ended up co-teaching with Whitehead the last 2 years of his seminars in metaphysics. We have actually a bunch of his notes for those 2 years, which should eventually ended up in our critical edition volumes. And when Paul Schilp published his first Library of Living Philosophers volume on John Dewey's philosophy in 1939, it was actually Hocking who pestered him to do a volume on Whitehead. We have some of those letters. But an unexpected source of information on the occasion comes from a biography of Christiana Morgan, a Harvard psychoanalyst who was a lover of Henry Murray, the director of the Harvard Psychological Clinic. The biography is entitled Translate This Darkness, The Life of Christiana Morgan. And apparently the two became close during the time when they lived in the same apartment building on Memorial Drive, with Whitehead becoming an almost surrogate father figure, apparently. She called him Altie, as many of Whitehead's intimates did. The biography said that at the 80th birthday dinner, Morgan sat on Whitehead's immediate right, and she has a detailed diary entry for the occasion. She actually reports that there were 38 people, a lower and more precise number than Lowe's 50, and says that Henry Sheffer and Ralph Barden Perry were guests, with Edward Pickman the toastmaster. Morgan disliked Pickman's speech. She thought it was inadequate, but she liked the follow-up by George Morgan, who was one of Whitehead's former students, and I don't think any relation to Christiana Morgan herself. Then some telegrams and letters of congratulations were read, presumably some of those now in our collection. And the one that was most pleasing to Whitehead, according to Morgan, which again I have no trouble believing, was from Lord Halifax, who was thanking him for the donation made to the war effort on his behalf by the Society as Fellows, because of course this was 1942 and we were right in the middle of World War II. But yeah, that's about it. I think I'll leave it there. So thanks for listening, and hopefully you found some of that helpful, and I'll hand it back over to Brianne so we can get the discussion started.
Thanks, Joe. I don't know about the rest of you, but sometimes when I hear these narratives that Joe gives, it just feels like such a different time, that people were gathered together and they were making notes of what they were doing and where people were sitting, and the judge couldn't come. And it's just, there seemed to be, I mean, it just feels like if a tree fell in the forest, would it even happen? Like, I can hardly imagine the records of like contemporary academics today. It always feels like we're entering some fictional movie. So thanks, Joe. All right, we've got, I sent a couple questions to you all, and I want to get started following Joe in chronological order with the toast. And so the question that I sent you, and I'll put it here to get us started, but also hopefully we'll be able to range widely. So let me put the two parts of it here, and then I'll give you some time to write. I'm going to put two options for questions. Here's question 1, and here's question 2. Oops, there's question 2. There we go. So in his toast to politician Alfred Smith, Whitehead seems to validate a colonial past. For example, the great empires all have a Puritan origin, page 18. While emphasizing the present political importance of cultural diversity, concern for the quote, lower section of the population, page 19, and balancing previous virtues and with newer ideals. So there's two options for your question. One, how do you map these political reflections onto Whitehead's philosophy of organism? And two, do you think Whitehead's assessment of statecraft here impedes or improves the value of his work for contemporary thought? And I'm especially here thinking about just this, the kind of colonial element that recently I read a piece by Claire Palmer on Whitehead's colonialism. And so it's just giving me some pause, and then reading this, I wanted to get your thoughts. So all I ask is that you put 1 or 2 in terms of which question you're attempting to tackle. And why don't I put about 3.5 minutes on the clock? And at the end of that time, I'll invite you all to hit enter at the same time. So choose 1 or 2. And if you're dissatisfied with these questions, just throw in what you want. And we'll come back in about 3.5, 4 minutes. See you all in a few. All right, we're at time, so go ahead and as you're ready, you can hit enter and let's populate this chat, see where we go. Let's start with the question 1, which is how do you map these political reflections onto Whitehead's philosophy of organism? So Brian says, Whitehead's Victorian, colonial, empire sensibilities at times do shine through, and they often make me cringe. However, and perhaps I'm being defensive for him, I tend to see them at odds with my own interpretation of the philosophy of organism. On this point, Claire Palmer has some fair concerns in her article, if memory serves, though I disagree with the claims in her monograph on Whitehead and environmental ethics. Brian, I'm going to come back to you a minute on the cringing, but I'll read another response. Lynn says, perhaps Whitehead would have agreed with Wordsworth that, quote, the child is the father of the man. Whitehead's notion of an unfolding organism suggests that the organism has some formative seed. This accounts, I think, for much of Whitehead's conservatism. All right, so let's pause there with these two. So I guess, Brian, I wonder if you'd talk about the cringing and if anyone else wants to comment on the cringing. And then maybe we'll turn to Lynn's thoughts here for, yeah, let's start with the cringe. I think the cringe is a good place to start because I think it's, as an emotion, the cringe is a very interesting one. You know, like, is it dread? Is it fear? Is it, and tell me about it, Brian, and let's get others to weigh in here.
We all have instances where we read philosophers whose thought we admire, and they'll make claims that I would want to tend to see them as a product of their time, not of their work, of their ideas, and I tend to sometimes want to see them in these modes. But I know that he's got a clear sort of thread of sort of what I would see as unfortunate Victorian sort of conservatism that is just there throughout his work and ideas, and so I don't know that I would go as far as some, but I do think I need to scrutinize whether or not I'm just trying to be defensive for him, or whether or not, is that really a product of his thought. I think Claire Palmer wants to say, that it's a function of his thought, not just an inconsistency with it, and that I have a little more trouble seeing, because I usually see them as at odds with it. But anyway, I don't know that I have much more to add. Of course, yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Brian. Well, my question here, Brian, was I tend to see them at odds with my interpretation of the philosophy of organism. And I guess having just read Claire Palmer's article myself, I would just invite you to say a bit more. So where you see this Victorian sensibility at odds with the philosophy of organism, can you say more about that?
Well, I just look at it through the lens of everything aiming at the production of beauty. We have an ideal aim at the achievement of processes callogenic, as I would interpret it, as beauty generating. And so beauty is this mix between harmony and intensity. There's always the balance between order and novelty in his work. He's got a conservatism that is a positive version of that. I was just reading a chapter of Joe's dissertation. This is the top of my mind, and he could talk more about sort of these dyads, and that he's thinking about the freedom and order essay, which I guess we've read together. Yeah. And so he's trying to balance those, and there's a sense in which pure change is not a good thing. We need to have conservation and adventure both. And I think that's positive. I think that's good. And I think that's consistent with his work. The whole Puritan empire sort of thing, I want to say this is a function of the toast format, but it's not totally that. It's got to be that he's also just sort of got sympathies with the British Empire and its greatness and and other empires, and the Roman Empire. I don't know. So the unabashed sort of positivity about empire just feels at odds with this beauty-centered sort of interpretation that I would take as his, as central to his idea.
Thanks, Brian. Lynn will come back to you in a minute, but I see that Rudiger's got a question here that I think might tie in with what we're talking about. Rudiger says, if you scroll down, everyone, you'll see this. Whitehead's philosophy of organism is the opposite of any kind of political conservatism, also, quote, green conservatism. Rudiger, I wonder if can you come through and say a little bit more? Just jump in here.
Hello, hi, do you hear me? Hi, good. Yeah, I mean, it's of course, it's always let's say I'm of course thinking a lot about also the political implications of Whitehead's philosophy, and I see this let's say also this his approach to sorry, I'm not so used to speak English. I first have to find the right words. So, I mean, his organistic, let's say, view of the universe, of course, leads to the fact that whatever you do, you are changing the future and the universe. So that means you have no chance to conserve something. There is no conservative way of doing something, because even if you try this, you change the future. So therefore, it simply does not make sense to try to live in a way that you don't change the world. And this is a very, I think, that does not mean that you can do what you want and you don't have to take care about how you change the world. Of course, you have to be responsible. Of course, it is also the starting point of ethics, that whatever you do, you change the future. But it's senseless to say that we want to conserve or to conserve the past, or something which was in the past. So that's just what I wanted to say.
No, thank you. That's really helpful. Anyone want to get in on this? You can just raise your digital hand and Brian can moderate, and we'll come back to the chat in a minute.
Oh yeah, what the damn actions? Yeah, raising.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, Bill, I guess.
Go ahead, Bill.
Things happen. Things get built. Things get built. Empires get built. Organisms get large. They fail. Things happen. So part of his admired. It's a life form. An empire is a life form, I suppose. A human, a fact of human. It's almost incidental to human activity. It's going to happen. There'll be an integument of administration and effect of this empire, small or large, and he's trying to make them as good as possible. And he wants to make them as beautiful as possible. But the fact that they're big and happening, that's interesting in itself. It's, I'm not anyway. I just wanted to say that. Yeah, so you can cringe. Things will happen there that make you cringe. That is for darn sure. We've proved that again and again. But the fact that they do happen, that's kind of written into the works.
Thanks, Bill. So just a reminder, everybody, and I think I had the settings wrong myself. So feel free to, I think we're small enough you can wave like this, and one of us will catch your waving on the screen. Or you can also raise your virtual hand if you want in the reactions at the bottom of the screen. Click on reactions and then click raise hand. And that will, I'd be happy to invite you to unmute yourself. Yeah, Lynn, let's see. There you go. Go ahead.
Bill's, excuse me, Bill's comment reminded me of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was written around the turn of the century. I can't remember the date and I can't go back and check it right now, but that had the same idea embedded in it, this idea that the empire was an organism and that it was going, when it got too large, it would fail for various reasons. And Gibbon's point actually was about the British Empire, that he was officially talking about the Roman Empire, but his real critique, his underlying critique, was on the British Empire. It seems to me that these ideas they're deeply embedded in the background of Whitehead. The way, you remember that old song, all things bright and beautiful, all things both great and small? That kind of Episcopal background, I think, is just embedded in Whitehead. And when he reaches back for imagery, that's what he pulls up. And I think that if I can just go into my idea, I think that's in his idea of organism, has that idea that the organism grows from something, and eventually it can outgrow it, but that core that began it is meaningful in its development. Okay, I'll shut up there.
Let me return to the chat. We have a second question, which is about Whitehead's assessment of statecraft. Does it impede or improve the value of his work for contemporary thought? And Thomas says, I found the discussion of statesmanship particularly relevant to the political situation of today. Whitehead's emphasis on, quote, diverse cultural origins. Successful states gather into themselves large heterogeneous populations of diverse cultural origins. This is the quote. Successful states gather into themselves large heterogeneous populations of diverse cultural origins, exhibiting diverse modes of excellence. The riddle of statesmanship consists in this question. Are these accessory populations to be converted into a liability or an asset? This is the problem of the making of a nation, end quote. Yeah, let's pause here. I'd really welcome to hear other people's thoughts on this particular phrasing. Thanks, Thomas.
Thomas, just so we can bring it up if we wanted to, do you have the page reference, the PDF page reference for that quotation, Thomas?
Oh, there I go. Yes, it's on page 18.
Very good. Thank you. It's a great quote. I'm glad you brought it to our attention.
You know, I just want to say something to that. As I was reading it through kind of a contemporary lens, I think this concept that's very current in vernacular is this sense of privilege. And sometimes it does feel that Whitehead is kind of holding court about people who are not him. And so it's this, you know, like, oh, will these people be a liability or an asset, right? In a sense, I always feel that it's a kind of compassionate question, or I mean, it's a metaphysical question, I guess. At the same time, it's not where he's located. And I don't really know that I have any more comments than that. It's just that there's this experiential distance, and what is the kind of pitfall of philosophy to kind of abstract the ideals of society, to kind of speak about the marginalized in a way that, I don't know, isn't objectifying? Maybe I'll just leave it there.
Two quick additional thoughts, Brianne. And one, he doesn't seem to be hinting at an assimilationist view that I see here, not an obviously, which we would almost expect to have seen, at least on the American scene, about what it would be to bring in diverse people. He doesn't, which is interesting. He does just as asset. He doesn't really, we don't have enough here to know exactly what it could mean, but I think that's noteworthy. The other thing I'd like to ask everybody is, the more I read this first sentence, the less I feel like I know what he's talking about. I don't understand what he means when he says the great empires all have a Puritan origin. So he's talking about Rome. Rome had a Puritan origin. Okay, what the heck is he talking about? I really honestly don't understand how he's using that term in this context. Is anybody able to help me out? And I think you're able to, we're small enough. I'm going to try it out. If we can just go ahead and unmute yourself. I think we're small enough that we're going to give this a try just to go ahead and see if we can make this work. So you don't even need to raise your hand. If you want to jump in, just unmute yourself. Feel free, Lynn.
Well, it's been a heck of a long time since I've read The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, but I do think that was one of Gibbon's major points, that not that it was Puritan, but that there was a sense of shared values, of stoicism, hard work that are very, very similar to what we would think of as Puritan values. And so that my guess is that may be what was in the back of Whitehead's mind. Does that make any sense to people? I'm just kind of curious about that.
Well, I think it is also just sort
It
of
does to me.
in the next sentence when it just says they are founded by the tribes of men who face life with an iron discipline and a narrow code. And also I was thinking too of, kind of in connection with this, but I forget, I think it was on the page earlier perhaps, but he was talking about how simplicity is a quality of great statesmen. And that made me recall when he talked about freedom and order and was talking about humors as in sort of the mood of the people.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think he probably means it in that sense of people, they had this humor that was Puritan-like, as Lynn was just saying.
Yeah.
That's helpful. Thank you.
So just to jump on that particular question of the Puritan, can you pull up that quote again, Brian? Oh yeah, there. The great empires all have a Puritan origin. So my first thought, again, maybe I'm trying to, I'm biased in my reading too, was to think that there was a reform quality. I mean, it wasn't the Puritans, weren't they reforming the Church of England? But then when you read the second line, I don't know how to, I'm not sure what Roman farmers, Norman warriors, and Anglo-Saxon Puritans, or were those all reformers? So maybe, I don't know, help.
And of course, we have this sentence down here too, is Puritan America on the way to convert its diverse populations into an element of strength. Which is an interesting choice of terms.
It is.
I'm sorry, who was jumping in? Was it you, Bill? No, Rudiger.
I thought about science and the modern world here. I mean, he's extremely polite, and in Science and the Modern World, he is writing 20 pages or more how great the modernist science are, and then he was starting his criticism. So, and I think he is also extremely polite here. If he first have this he is comparing this myth with Trajan and so yeah, I think he wants to make him great and being polite, huh? No. But I'm also not sure about it. It's yeah, but I really appreciate to be confronted with this text, which I never would read without this reading group. Is really surprising, yeah.
Matt, are you, do you want to weigh in here? I see you put a comment here and I can read it, or if you're welcome to read it out loud too. I'd love to, but I don't see you on the screen. Oh, there you are, footnotes. Yeah. Yeah, Matt, come through and give us your thoughts. Audio there.
Sorry about that. I'm dealing with two screens here and had to figure it out. Yeah, I'm really appreciating this conversation, and it's so great to learn more about Whitehead's political views, in the context of a toast like this. And I guess what I'm trying to hint at it in my comment here is, I guess taking, like, if I were to live into Whitehead's point of view on history, which comes through in many of his works, Adventures of Ideas in particular, he really is trying to hold this balance between the conservation and progression, right? And when I think about empire and colonialism, I mean, yeah, of course, in our current moment, we have so many reasons to critique and to want to arrive at the sort of world where that form of coercive power is no longer what is guiding the operation of our nations and the relationship between our nations. But I think historically, I wonder if it's utopian and unrealistic and ahistorical even to try to imagine, because if we're going to critique empire and even colonialism as though anyone who points to the positive values that were part of that, it's as if we're saying history could have been otherwise. Maybe it could have, but I also think part of the values that we inherit in order to critique colonialism were part of at least what the better parts of British colonization, what they thought they were motivated by, even if they failed to live up to those values. Similarly, with the founding of the United States of America, if you look at the founding documents, there are ideals put on paper that obviously were not lived up to, but that later did have positive consequences, and we continue to try to realize those ideals. But it just seems to me we might be drawing upon some of the very ideals of British Empire, for example, and the cultural impetus behind that in order to critique that. And so it's kind of like we can't just, in a way, forget what is being conserved and making it possible for us to levy these critiques. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I really enjoy that, Matt. I mean, and it seems very much of our time right now in this figuring out how to progress and conserve its order and adventure right now is a really, really difficult problem for us. If I may, there's a quotation at the beginning of the piece that I'd like to connect that to get to see if it connects with it. But it's this paragraph at the beginning, which was my favorite in this piece, this on page, which PDF page 15, I think it's page 2 of the talk. When the immigrant populations left the western shores of Europe, they could shake its dust from their feet, but they could not remove from their souls the impress of racial inheritance. In America, the buildings are new, but the people are old. You may strive to sink your past in the mid-Atlantic, but its ghost returns and haunts your forests, your plains, and your cities. Wherever men live, their past lives with them. It pursues them as an inspiration or as a fury, but there is no escape. I love this paragraph.
I love it. I love it too.
This is really, really good. And the role of the past is a really important part of our understanding of Whitehead, and Jude Jones's book Intensity is sort of central to my own thinking about this. Nancy Frankenberry writes on this as well, but on the power of the past, and I think that we frequently make the past into the material cause of the present rather than, as Whitehead says, the efficient cause. of the present. But this is so beautifully poetic and sort of connects in interesting ways to today. So I just wanted to draw our attention to it. But Matt's comments reminded me of it. So thanks for those. Really, I agree with you, Matt, that we. Anyway, I agree. I guess I want to say I agree with how I took your comments.
And like you were saying, Brian, part of this might be my defensiveness, trying to, protect Whitehead here. But I think there's something valuable in his notion of a form of conservation or conservatism, even that can't just simply be dismissed, even by progressives who do want to implement and realize different values, new values. I think so many times, as this paragraph points out, those values are actually inheritances that we're not fully aware of, where they've come from and what makes us capable of that critique in the first place.
I see a continuity between what he wants to conserve here. He wants to conserve the gift of Christianity to Western civilization, page 6 of one of the PDFs, the notion of the value of each human life. Now that's written into his cosmology and metaphysics, the value of each occasion, that's for the whole. And so there's a hard continuity here. We're preserving the past of the cosmos in each of us. That's, a difficult task to write into an imperial constitution. But that's his idea, I think. That's what he's feeling for. Each of us, the flower in the crannied wall.
That connects to my question, Bill, which is about, I don't know. Yeah, where am I? This Whitehead writes on, I think it's page 7 of the, I actually don't know, Brian. I don't remember if my pages were of the document. I think they might have been of the PDF. Civilization is founded on the direct challenge to the unchecked operation of natural forces. And
is this right? I don't know if this is page PDF 7. I don't know if you want PDF 7 or.
That's the second to last paragraph. You were just...
I can see it actually written in there and by hand.
Yep.
Gosh, isn't that crazy? This is like traveling in time. See this person's like where they wrote in where he wrote in the margin. And I thought, is this, he's referencing that what's unique about Smith is that he's a Christian statesman and that seems to be lacking. And so is this direct challenge, I would just love to hear how people interpret this, the direct challenge to the unchecked operation of natural forces. Is that direct challenge the Christian aspect of Smith's politics or Whitehead's thought, or is it the process aspect, or is Whitehead's version of Christianity really inseparable from his concept of process? All right, so let me come back here to the.
Brianne, so,
Yeah,
if I
go ahead.
could, as a complete rube in all of this, just to, that idea of process. I was really struck in this by, I just had kept on having these resonances to that passage, and I think it's in Adventures and Ideas about, that Marshall McLuhan quoted about, it's the business of the future to be dangerous, and that whole stuff that comes prior to that about the necessity of wandering and and how the importance of wandering and the importance of having skills. And in this, in his speech, he talks about, civilizations, that no civilization has been self-perpetuating. The summit is reached and a mysterious withering sets in, and thus it should be with Christian democracy too, unless there is this wandering. And so in a sense, this tension between progress and conservatism, I mean, I always saw Whitehead as being, I mean, as much as I pictured him as this kind of Edwardian guy, and I was sorry I missed him. I was in Boston. I always saw this sense of wandering and of journeying and of looking forwards, and that being and that's what I kept on taking out of this, that sense of here we are, here we are at present, but the summit is reached and a mysterious withering sets in. So we have to keep wandering. We have to keep journeying, equipping ourselves with skills. And he says that's really important, but it's not enough to stay where we are.
It's helpful. Thank you.
Should we move on to the other piece, Brianne? I guess we're just about at 10. Well, top of the hour, I should say, since we're all sorts of different time zones.
Yes, we shall. So let's I gotta pull up my question. Oh, this one's a little rough. I think we'll have to do a wild card here as well. Let's just. All right, so the question I sent around, this was regarding the toast, sorry, the remarks for Whitehead's 80th birthday. And now, Joe, I think you said this was kind of as he was getting ready to step away from academics. Okay, so here's the question. In the birthday remarks, how do you understand Whitehead's claim, quote, every philosophic lecture room should contain as exhibits a baby at one end, an emeritus professor at the other end, the future and the past, and in between the surging present, namely the confused thoughts of the lecturer and his class in relation to his broader work. Now, I guess actually been touching on some of these, but maybe this is a good enough point to start with. Let's see, Brian, do you have a suggestion here? Should I do a timed comment, or since there's so few of us, can we just talk, or what do you think?
Well, since we've all read it and it's nicely transcribed and it's short, I guess my inclination would to think we might be able to just proceed to jump in.
Okay.
And then if we are too slow, then we can, give ourselves a second to collect thoughts and share them.
Yeah, will you pull up that passage? Let's see if I can find where it is.
Let me see. Let me try and make this a little bit bigger for people. Let's see.
I guess I was especially taken by this because of the reference of a baby. And I'll just say one word about that. I always think there's like two things that really blow my mind. And one is that riding in an airplane, like we're just like hurtling in a metal tube through space while we're having a beer. Everyone's just like, oh, really, really relaxed. And the other thing is that we all lived inside the body of another person, and that we just never talk about it once we're out. And it's rarely ever talked about in philosophy. I mean, it's just hardly ever talked about ever. Like it's crazy. And so when as soon as I saw this passage about the baby, I was trying to think of like, what is this, the connection of this nascency with this end of academics. So those are just the thoughts I had here. Where is it, Brian? Oh, I see it. Yeah.
I'd like to especially invite anybody who hasn't yet had a chance to jump in and feels like it. This would be a great time to add a new voice to our conversation, feel free to unmute yourself and share on this point that Brianne is bringing to our attention, or any other. Peter?
Yeah, am I unmuted? Yep. I was mainly thinking about the earlier questions regards to the toast, I guess, rather than this.
Fair enough. I noticed you
Yeah,
unmuted
yeah.
yourself, so I was
Yeah.
making sure to give you space.
Yeah, it's just that I noticed that Daniel was here, for instance, and I had a look at his book, which he wrote on the relationship between Whitehead and Rawls, oddly enough. And so I was hoping to, I wasn't sure whether he was going to be here or not, and I was hoping to hear something from him on that, I guess, because as I said in my comment, it seems to me that Whitehead in many areas has this very pragmatic emphasis. And I have a background in the social sciences, and I guess politics is a social science. And what is particularly noticeable about the social sciences is their emphasis on action, and they understand themselves in terms of action. And Whitehead has this philosophy that is more than perhaps any other philosophy, has a conception of action, and that is made very explicit, for instance, compared to the pragmatists, who also have the similar emphasis. He has a much more developed conception of action. So for instance, his conception of symbolism, for instance, it's much more pragmatic, it seems, than the pragmatists. And I was wondering whether one is seeing this in this emphasis on statesmanship, an emphasis on political actors rather than political institutions, whereas the point that Daniel was making by comparing process thinkers to Rawls was looking much more at the institutional side of politics. So it seems to me you can get very different conceptions of politics. And this is what you sort of expect to find in Whitehead, because he's so effective at combining different points of view. So Rawls is coming from a much more abstract, Kantian, impersonal conception of politics, whereas what we're seeing here in Whitehead's remarks was much more focused on a particular individual and their insights into political situations, that sort of thing. Anyway, I'll stop there.
I'm bummed that Dan has left us because I would have loved to have drawn him into the conversation on that topic, as well as his other book on force and persuasion, which is also related to this conversation. Dan sort of is a forceful advocate of the view that Whitehead is a clear liberal, and in the classical political theory sort of sense of that. It would have been fun to have engaged him, but darn it, maybe we could try and figure out a way to do that next time. But he probably had to go to a classroom meeting. But I did post in the chat a link to his book. That's actually, it's hard to keep up. If you know Dan's work, it's hard to keep up with his work because he writes so darn many books. But I haven't read that one, Peter. But the force, I'll post the Force to Persuasion one as well, which is good.
Yeah, nor have I.
Well, Brian, I'm wondering if what we could do is just to allow people to write out or to identify a passage in the toast or in the 80th birthday remarks that they connected with.
That sounds good. In the chat, just post a quote that you like, and if possible, put the, well, I guess there are only 2 pages. Never mind, I was going to say to put the quote, but I guess it's not needed. So feel free to.
Yeah, some comment that jumped out at you, something that resonated, something you'd like to bring to the group. Just take a look at your notes and let's see what you all think.
Okay.
Here you can cut and paste if you want, if you have the document open. So that works out. Lynn, the Rawls and Whitehead citation there is that link to the Amazon book there. While people are typing and looking for a quote, the human language is inadequate to express experience in our context of sort of discussing Whitehead's legacy and analytic thought. I always look for and mark passages as he discusses both the importance and inadequacy of language. I find it such a helpful moderation to some of the other views that we have of the adequacy of language. And so this is just a consistent discussion of that. And he just fundamentally disagreed with those who at the time and after him about what language can achieve, including with Russell and C.I. Lewis and others. All right, we've got some good ones coming through.
All right, let's see here. We've got Carol. The previous World War introduced unforgettable, intense tragedy into life. The only way to meet tragedy is to interweave it with loving activity. Carol, you want to say more about why this resonated with you?
Well, I'll out myself as somebody who sits and listens to the conversation, but I'm somewhat hesitant to speak because I don't have the background in this that you have. But I'm a pastor and I have drawn on Whitehead's work, and to me, this is very much what my work is about, is trying to take the tragedy, the reality, and well, it's what God is about, I think, with the initial aim and moving toward beauty.
I really find that to be really important, Carol, just because sometimes I think there's a question of Whitehead's applicability, because it's not always argued. Whitehead doesn't argue how to apply it. So to see someone trying to work it into their vocation in the world, I think is really, there's so much space for Whitehead to do that.
I tie it into my work as a pastor, but I also draw heavily on a family systems theory that fits very well with process thinking in Whitehead's work, and is extremely applicable, at least in my mind.
Would anyone like to weigh in on this particular quote? Maybe it resonated with you also.
I like this quote as well, Carol. And one thing that I've found noteworthy about Whitehead's thinking, and I believe it's Adventures of Ideas, but there's an unavoidable tragedy to reality for him. And he sees it as a means for intense experience, to use, again, the language of, doesn't necessarily mean it's good necessarily, but it is always interesting to the tragic nature of reality. Anyway, I like that passage as well. So I'm glad you brought it. The loving activity part, I would note that he tends to, again, in Adventures of Ideas, which would have been a few years before this was written, he tends to use eros when he talks about love there. And I've written that I don't think that's the best use of love. The Peirce uses agape instead of eros, and I think that was a better choice in terms of the relationship of love to tragedy in particular. So Anyway, this seems to me to not be eros at all, right, in this passage. So for the better, I guess. Anyway, so thanks for bringing it to our attention.
I think, Lynn, did you have a hand?
I also love the quote, and to me, it brought out his grief at the death of his son. It's a very personal quote, and what he did to overcome that sense of tragedy and recharge his life. And I think the fact that it has so much personal tragedy in it makes it even more evocative for us.
Let's see, Richard is pulling out a quote as well. Every single doctrine that I was taught in Cambridge during my student period from 1880 to 1885 has now been abandoned in the sense in which it would then be understood. The doctrines are still important with limitations and distortions and modifications. It's the business of philosophers to live in the present. Richard, you want to say a word on this?
Just a short word. So it first struck me when I read this, because I teach in a science faculty, and yet I tell my students that everything that they're learning now is likely to be completely wrong in 20 years. But if they took some philosophy courses or arts courses, what they learn about Aristotle today will be of use to them through their entire lives. And he was a mathematics student. The mathematics that he might have learned has been abandoned in some ways. The framework for thinking about it was important, but it just hit me that, that he was also realizing that what we learn when we're young, especially maybe in the math or science field, can be really out of date. But we have to be staying on top of things, and philosophy, as he's saying, is living in the present, not in the past, not staying with those things that we've learned. Again, it's that adventure of ideas business about, wandering. Anyways, it just struck me.
I would like to, I see that there's a question here about language in Wittgenstein, so I'm going to hold that for a minute. And I want to turn to Michael Heather's comment here, who points out a particular correction in this text, the correction from infinite to unbounded. Michael says that this is significant of his shift from PM to PR. PM, Michael, help me here. What is PM?
Principia Mathematica.
Yes, right.
Yes, right.
Do you want to say a word about the significance that you see, Michael?
Well, this is a very significant shift from the logic of PM to PR, which mainstream has not caught up with yet. It's absolutely fundamental to postmodernism, postmodern mathematics. Would talk about it being unbounded. You get this in category theory. It's a free functor valued category. Whereas in set theory, of course, infinite is a number, whereas numbers don't exist in nature.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on this? I would really like to invite some conversation on this shift from the infinite to the unbounded, if anyone would like to.
Glad that Michael is bringing our attention to it, because I just read the transcription, see, and and this is what you miss when you do that. So, or maybe I just didn't pick it up when I was looking at the transcription. But so thank you, Michael, for first of all reminding us of what we can glean from having these original documents to be able to consider how Whitehead is striking and revising.
I'm interested in Michael's comment that we are still not understanding the shift from infinite to unbounded, and still not totally appreciating the ideas that he put forth in Process and Reality. I'd love to hear you expound a little more on that.
Well, it's a big subject, that.
Yes,
that
yes, true.
no,
Unbounded.
what I would call postmodern mathematics is category theory, but
Yes.
even mainstream there is wedded, is anchored in set theory, which is unfortunate because the category of sets doesn't exist in the universe. I mean, the set doesn't exist. There's nowhere can you find a set. And sets, the elements of a set are independent of one another. But that's quite contrary, of course, to Whitehead's non-separability. He doesn't say everything's connected, but he says they're non-separable. And that's again, it's at this point here between the infinite and the unbounded.
Thank you.
So, as far as I can see, Whitehead was put in words what category theory now puts out formally. So it's amazing the stuff that fits. And he didn't have the power of symbolic logic in Process and Reality that he had, of course, in Principia Mathematica.
Thank you.
I almost feel hesitant to shift gears. I think each of these points that Carol has raised and Michael has raised, that I would like to dwell on them. But as we're coming to the end, let me turn to this next group of questions. Rudiger has pulled out a quote that human language is inadequate to express experience. Brian mentioned this as well. And he wanted to raise the question of Whitehead's relation to Wittgenstein as a kind of linguistic philosopher. Joe adds a point here. Whitehead seems quite contemptuous of Wittgenstein. At one point, he wrote in a letter that Wittgenstein, quote, annoyed him intensely, end quote. Also, in the recent published critical edition volume, there is a student presentation on the Tractatus in his seminar, and Whitehead is not impressed.
Actually,
yeah.
I did, as the conversation was going on, I went looking for that letter where he says that, and I found the fuller quote, which I'll read because it's interesting on this question. He says, yet some of the expositions I find myself in violent opposition. This is a letter to Henry S. Leonard, by the way. Especially to the very habit of discussing questions as unmeaning, i.e. unable to be expressed in existing symbolism. Wittgenstein annoys me intensely. He is a complete example of the saying, I am master of this college, what I know not is not knowledge. Logical positivism in this mood, its early mood, will produce a timid, shut-in, unenterprising state of mind engaged in the elaboration of details. I always test these general rules by trying to imagine the sterilizing effect of such a state of mind, if prevalent at any time in the last 10,000 years.
He includes in that list what is Wittgenstein, Russell, and what was the third? There was a third person that he's referring to, right, in that passage. They're bright boys, he says, if I recall correctly.
Oh, let's see.
Anyway, the link to the pieces at the Library of Congress is in the, although the handwritten piece was donated to the Library of Congress a bit ago.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Russell, Wittgenstein, and Carnap.
Carnap, that was the third. Bright boys, he says, but it's uncharacteristically harsh. Of course, it's in a personal letter, which, but that's not characteristic of him, as we all know. Rudiger, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is very, very interesting, but it's everything is from the period of Tractatus. Yeah? I mean, the switch which Whitehead made from Principia Mathematica to Process and Reality is no, I mean, it's not comparable, but a little bit similar to Wittgenstein's switch from Tractatus to Philosophical Investigations. And I never had heard something about whether Whitehead was aware of Wittgenstein's also switch or shift his movement. Yeah? So maybe not, I don't know.
I really doubt it. I feel like since he didn't like what he'd done in the Tractatus, that he just wouldn't have followed, because there were plenty of other things he could have been reading. He was like, kind of dismissed him.
Yeah.
I agree. Joe, correct my memory if I'm wrong, but it wasn't Whitehead instrumental in getting a fellowship for Wittgenstein at Cambridge. I think he was one of the people who
Russell was advocating for him, and then I think
I think that Whitehead could be seen as one of the people who helped him get his fellowship at Cambridge. But I agree with Joe. Yeah, there's no evidence that he continued to follow his work. Unlike Russell, who obviously stayed more abreast of what he was doing. This piece was 1930. This letter was 1936, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah, January 1936. But he even mentions in the letter logical positivism. Like he's talking specifically about logical positivism, not what was happening in the 30s, for example, or the 40s. Yeah. He's really referring to early in the 20th, late 19th century, I think.
I think maybe there's really nothing to about him then. Yeah, thank you.
Joe, do we have a link to the transcription of that letter somewhere? Oh, you know what? There's a process studies article. If you Google it, someone wrote a process studies article, and I think it's available online somewhere if you do a little bit of searching. Someone wrote an article about that letter, and I think the letter transcription is part of the article, if my memory serves. It's a great letter. It'll appear eventually. We're going to edit 2 volumes of letters. Well, 1 volume of correspondence, and then Nicholas Griffin at McMaster at the Russell Archives is editing a volume of the correspondence between Whitehead and Russell. Has been for more than a decade. I'm hoping he's making progress on that, but he's going to do a volume just on the correspondence between Russell and Whitehead on writing of the Principia, which, to be honest, I'm sad to say is really only the really philosophically interesting bit of his correspondence. The rest of his correspondence, with the exception maybe of a handful, like this 1936 letter, he tended in his letters to maintain personal relationships. He didn't do much philosophy, as Russell famously complains that he just didn't do much philosophy in personal correspondence. And so it is not necessarily that we don't have it, although that's probably true too. It's that he just didn't do much philosophy, in that mode. So we've got lots of birthday wishes and, and wedding, notes and things like that in his personal correspondence. So you can see with whom he was corresponding and had personal relations, but they weren't usually philosophically interesting. The Russell correspondence of, and that collaboration is the major exception. And I'm hoping someday Nick Griffin will finish that project.
And of course, we did look at that letter here between him and Russell. And also on that point, I wanted to say too that we have that letter that he wrote, the short one to Lowe, where Lowe had basically said, can I quote your letters about whatever? And when Whitehead said, oh God, no, don't do that. Please don't quote my letters.
Brian, sorry, I've got a siren here. Brian, could you pull up the handwritten document to the bottom? something that I think Thomas said. I'm looking for this passage that says, you have a tremendous task before you. The world is passing into a new epoch. Okay, and then it says here, yeah, your life, and then life is struck through and it's replaced with philosophical thought. Your philosophic thought is in the present should prepare mankind for the unknown future. And I wondered about this shift between your life in the present and your philosophic thought in the present should prepare mankind for the unknown future. Did anyone have any thoughts on this correction?
To remind me of what we're looking at, apologies, I should know this. This is Hawking's notes about Whitehead's comments at Whitehead's 80th birthday, right?
Well, this is Whitehead's handwriting. I mean, it's what he's written out for himself.
Okay, so so it's not. Oh, so this is not. Okay, I want to make sure this is not Hawking. Okay,
Yeah,
so
that's
the note at the top.
Yeah, that's the top 2 pages is Hawking.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, it's especially interesting given what we're just talking about Wittgenstein, right? That to shift from life to philosophic thought, it seems to almost enter into a sphere of abstraction from life. You know, I mean, I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts on why that shift.
Would we say that this is true of Whitehead himself as a person, that his philosophic thought was dedicated to this, but not his life? Can we say that he didn't dedicate his life to this, but he did dedicate his philosophic thought?
What's the this, Brian?
Yeah, I'm leaving to the rest of the sentence, I suppose. Prepare mankind for the unknown future, I guess.
You mean that Whitehead was more invested in, Whitehead thought about the preparation for the future, but wasn't necessarily a kind of embodied advocate. He wasn't an on the ground kind of person.
He wasn't.
In some ways, right?
He wasn't the statesman. I'm just saying he wasn't the statesman. There are many roles to play in this, but Alfred Smith did what he could. But Whitehead maybe was too complex, and he knew it. He
wasn't a man of action.
Yeah.
but he was a dedicated teacher and administrator. I don't know. And an active community member within the university. He was a good academic, a good colleague, an active one. But he had the life of the mind, right? It is probably true of him. I think he wasn't early on. Maybe he was doing a little bit of political work, but he wasn't organizing. He wasn't an activist. He wasn't, right? So I don't know. I just thought, I hadn't even thought of it until you pointed out, Brianne, but it does seem true of him. And it's his 80th birthday.
Yeah, Lynn has added a comment here that Whitehead was nearing the end of life and realized that his thoughts, but not his life, would shape the future. Well, everyone, thanks for a really rich chat today. We have one more session on June 4th. That'll be our last session. Joe, do you want to say a word about what we'll be reading?
Yeah, I think it's an exciting way to end it. It's another original essay that I think really hasn't been seen before. It's called Science and Economic Liberty, a Comparison of England and America. And the interesting thing about this is the timing, because he wrote it in, or presented it in 1923, and it was after his first, for his first trip to America, which I wasn't aware until a few years ago when I read it in Lowe's biography, that he did in fact travel to America once. It was in April in 1922. So he came back and he's speaking in England. I don't know what the occasion was, but he was giving this presentation and making this comparison, not knowing at the time that he would be a year later migrating to Harvard because he didn't get the offer from Harvard until January of 1924. So this is this kind of cool in between sort of paper. So I'm excited to look at it.
Great. Brian, any last announcements?
No, only just to, I think we should thank Joe for picking great pieces from the archives. I agree that with Rudiger that I would never have reason. I mean, eventually we'd get to these in the edition, but I think you chose really well, Joe. These are really fun, interesting pieces that I wouldn't necessarily have had reason to focus on and think through. And it's fun to do it with people who have different perspectives on Whitehead. So it's been fun, and nice job, Joe, for making it focus on worthwhile pieces.
You're welcome. It has been fun.
Well, the fun is not over yet, folks. We've got more fun to come in early June. Be on the lookout for an email from us in the next week or so that will have a link to the video from today's conversation and some food for thought questions as you're reading. And we will see you in the same time, same place, through the web in 3 weeks' time. Thanks, everyone. Take care of yourself until then.